Less than 1% of taxpayers in Washington will end up paying this tax.
It's not going to be good for Washington state.
Lawmakers in Olympia are debating a controversial capital gains tax. At the heart of the issue, if a tax on profits from financial investments is an excise tax or an income tax, which voters have rejected multiple times.
Please vote no.
5096 is declared passed.
The bill narrowly cleared the Senate by one vote and now heads to the House. Will a new capital gains tax lead to more equity in Washington?
So this is a way to make it fair and fair for everyone.
It is a fallacy that this is going to tax the wealthy.
And will voters have the final say?
They will, for a 11th time, reject an income tax.
Our panel weighs in.
I think voters are going to support this, and because they know the communities desperately need revenues.
Debating a new state tax on the wealthy. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Lawmakers in Olympia are just a few steps away from enacting a statewide capital gains tax. Supporters say the tax would impact only 8,000 wealthy households in Washington on stocks and bond sales and would provide an important boost as we emerge from the COVID pandemic. But critics say this is an income tax, which is illegal in our state, and they claim the new measure could have a chilling effect on not just the ultra-rich, but our entire economy. No matter how you feel about a capital gains tax, you could have a say about its future very soon, as this controversial measure appears destined for challenges in court and at the ballot box. As Washington recovers from the coronavirus pandemic, some legislators say the structure of our state's economy needs a shot in the arm too.
I think COVID has really brought just income inequality to light and really laid it bare for folks.
Democratic Senator June Robinson is the prime sponsor of Senate Bill 5096 to enact a capital gains tax. The measure would apply a 7% tax on the sale of stocks, bonds, and businesses, but only when those profits exceed $250,000 annually.
Every step of the way, I have listened carefully.
After intense debate, Robinson carved out exemptions for sales of homes, commercial real estate, retirement accounts, and any family-owned small business that makes less than $10 million a year.
So you can see that it really is a tax on those with the most wealth in our state. Less than 1% of taxpayers in Washington will end up paying this tax.
The state would start collecting the tax in 2023, bringing in a projected $550 million in annual revenue.
Can you put that back up there?
$350 million of that would fund child care via the state's Education Legacy Trust account. The next $100 million would go to the general fund, and the rest to a newly created taxpayer fairness account to help state residents of lower income levels.
We have a very upside-down tax code in Washington.
Robinson points to a 2018 report that shows our state's low-income residents spend nearly 18% of their income on taxes, as opposed to 3% for the wealthiest. But critics say SB 5096 won't solve that problem.
We strongly oppose the bill.
Many industry groups point out that 27% of Washington state's businesses have had to shut down during the pandemic, thousands of them permanently. The Independent Business Association says a capital gains tax will negatively impact not only wealthy people, but any business trying to rebound from the restrictions of COVID.
It's effectively a tax on creativity, innovation, job creation, risk-taking. It penalizes small business owners that grow their business and become successful.
Republican Senator Lynda Wilson agrees.
It's not going to be good for Washington state.
While proponents claim the capital gains tax is an excise tax on a transaction like the sale of stocks, Wilson says the IRS calls it an income tax in 41 other states, which is illegal in Washington.
It's unconstitutional. It's an income tax, and people don't want it.
The measure passed through the Senate in early March by a one-vote margin, each Republican and 4 Democrats voted against it.
Senate Bill 5096 is declared passed.
And Wilson is concerned that as the bill makes its way to the House and finally to the governor, who has requested capital gains legislation since 2014, the state will face costly lawsuits and perhaps even a referendum vote this fall.
It's already gone to the people about 10 times, and every single time over the course of almost 100 years, they've said no.
State voters have indeed rejected income tax measures in the past, most recently in 2010, with the failure of I-1098. Wilson says that measure, like Senate Bill 5096, took aim at wealthy Washingtonians. But that's the beginning of what she sees as a slippery slope.
The idea is that they want to implement this bill so that the structure is in place to create a full-blown income tax on everyone.
It's not a slippery slope towards taxing more people on more things. It's actually lifting a lot of those burdens and making it more fair so we're all paying our fair share.
Sonya Campion is a philanthropist who runs the Campion Advocacy Fund. Her husband, Tom, is co-founder of Zoomies, the clothing and accessory store. She says a capital gains tax would impact their finances significantly, but helping the state fund its child care system and freeing up other resources for education, housing, or public lands are investments she believes in.
Everything we care about, the state government has a role in, and we want to be a dynamic partner.
A King 5 Survey USA poll in February showed 59% of the respondents support the idea of establishing a new tax on the state's top 2% of investment earners. And with reports showing Washington as having the most regressive tax structure in the country, Campion says it's time for a change.
We're rated worst in the nation in terms of unfairness, and I think we're better than that.
A push for fairness versus a pushback against what some call an unconstitutional income tax. That's the battle ahead as Democratic state lawmakers try to make their mark with a controversial capital gains tax this legislative session. And joining us to discuss this issue further, we have with us Andy Nicholas. He is a senior fellow from the Washington Budget and Policy Center, speaking in support of this. We also have with us Jason Mercier. He is the director of the Center for Government Reform from the Washington Policy Center, speaking in opposition. And before we get into some of the technical details, I want to start with some of the broader details of why this bill and why now. Andy, the idea of a capital gains tax has been floating around Olympia for nearly a decade here. Here in 2021, it passed the Senate by a 1-vote margin and will now head to the House and possibly the governor's desk here. Why is a tax like this needed? Why do you think it got the support it did in the Senate this year?
Well, thanks, Brian. It's great to be here. And it's also nice to see Jason. I really enjoy the conversations that he and I often have about important issues facing our state. So here's the reality right now. We've got the most upside-down regressive state and local tax code in the country. You know, the ultra wealthy in our state get a very special tax deal here, while the rest of us pay up to 6 times more of our incomes in state and local taxes compared to those to the very top. You know, we kind of get a tax penalty in Washington state just for being lower income or middle class. And while this is true for all Washingtonians, it's really especially true for our neighbors of color. You know, communities of color in Washington state, due to systemic racism going back generations, are much more likely to be in the lower income, higher taxed regions of the income scale. So we've got this really upside down tax code, but it's not true for everybody. The ultra wealthy, who also because of systemic racism are almost exclusively white, they get an enormous special deal. As I said, they pay, up to 6 times less of their incomes in state and local taxes. And we can't afford to maintain this special tax deal right now. We have still got 221,000 Washingtonians still out of work. There is desperate need for affordable, quality childcare in communities to help us grow our way up. And yet, during the pandemic and the recession, the very wealthy and the powerful in our state have seen their wealth grow enormously just the past year by billions of dollars. Yeah. The good news is lawmakers are listening right now. They're listening to communities and they're taking sensible steps to begin rebalancing our upside down tax code and generate the resources we're going to need to build our way out of this mess. Okay. What we're talking about is this tax on extraordinary profits. The first $250,000 in profits would be exempt on high-end financial assets like stocks and bonds.
Okay.
is only going to impact the richest 0.2% of residents in our state.
All right.
And the good news is that it would recirculate up to $500 million per year in resources to communities for early learning, childcare, and equitable reductions for Washingtonians at the bottom. And if we do this, we're going to create tens of thousands of jobs, boost spending at small businesses. This is going to be unambiguously good for the economy. So now really is the time to take this sensible step and start addressing the upside down tax code and building our way out.
Andy, thank you for breaking all that down. We're going to cover some of those pieces too. But Jason, I wanted to go to you on this. I know you oppose this measure. I guess the question to you is why not now on a capital gains tax? What are your big concerns as this works its way through the legislature?
Well, thank you, Brian. And as Andy mentioned, we've had this debate before, in fact, before the House Finance Committee in 2019. So it's a conversation been going on for a while. In fact, this conversation's been going on for about 100 years. Washington is one of 9 states without a personal income tax. And that is what this is about. It is trying to open that door. Why not now? For a few reasons. Our budget is balanced. We currently are showing revenue projections of more than 7%. Just this week, Congress has passed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, which is expected to send the state of Washington, both state government and schools, approximately $10 billion. And every indication is when we have our March 17th revenue forecast, that is going to be up substantially. This is not the Great Recession. That conversation might have been apt last spring. It's no longer the case now. So the question is, with that fiscal context and the fact that the voters have repeatedly rejected income taxes, why are we trying to now open that door in opposition to what we've consistently been told by voters?
Okay, got it. Jason, let me stick with you here, and I want to break open a legal argument that I think is very important as to whether this capital gains tax is a excise tax, how it's written, or as you have argued, an income tax, which is illegal in our state. Supporters say this capital gains tax is an excise tax, a lot like our real estate excise tax when there's a tax on the profit coming in from a sale. What do you say to that? I wanted to make sure we broke this down.
So an excise tax is a transactional tax. As you mentioned, it is point of sale on price or volume. So the REIT, the real estate excise tax, you pay when you sell your home on the total sale price. Other excise taxes are what we commonly refer to as the sin taxes, liquor, cigarette, gas. They're transactional taxes. There are no excise taxes on income. And when this bill was first proposed back in 2012 and it was referred to as an excise tax, that confused me because I've never heard of an excise tax on income. So I actually personally contacted the revenue director of every single state in the country, as well as the IRS, and just asked them point blank, are capital gains taxes, excise taxes, or income taxes? Every single tax professional in the world will tell you the same thing, as an income tax, because you're taxing the income. And in fact, the bill that is moving right now in the legislature, Senate Bill 5096, if you follow the bouncing ball of what is actually being taxed, it's not the sale. The tax applies in April when taxpayers submit their federal income tax return to the IRS. It's on the income, not on the transaction.
Okay. Andy, this is a bill that is certainly going to be heading to a court challenge if and when it becomes law. All 41 other states that have the capital gains tax call it an income tax, as Jason mentioned there. The IRS calls it that too. I wanted to make sure you responded to that.
Sure, this is plainly an excise tax on the transaction of extraordinary profits from the sale of financial assets. Those are the very top of the income and wealth ladders. This has been discussed for a long time. It's been clearly structured as an excise tax. And we can leave the arcane, legal arguments about, cases from the 1930s to the attorneys. But this is certainly structured as an excise tax on extraordinary profits from wealth. And now, as you alluded to, we have dozens of excise taxes on the books in Washington state. We've got the real estate excise tax, taxes on gas, on sales. What's different about this one is that this would be one that would be exclusively paid by the rich and the powerful in Washington state. And that's why they're pulling out all of the stops to try and stop this right now. But yeah, this is a common sense measure that is going to generate hundreds of millions of dollars per year to be recirculated in our communities and help us build back stronger than we were before.
Thank you. Jason, I want to make sure I move ahead here because I know the courts are going to go into that one if and when this passes here. But let's talk about this piece that Andy brought up earlier, because supporters of the capital gains tax tell us we've got the lower income residents in our state spending nearly 18% of their income on taxes, the wealthiest, only 3%. Our state's been named the most regressive in the nation when it comes to taxation here. Proponents would say this tax on capital gains, something that would affect this very small portion of our population, is at least a start down that path of rectifying that problem.
Yes, let me start first on the ranking, and then we'll get to what should happen next. By definition, any tax that is not a progressive income tax is regressive because it's a percentage base. It's not based upon the actual dollars the taxpayer submits to the government. So by default, the 9 states without personal income taxes will rank lower than the 41 states with personal income taxes. But even further on the state of Washington's tax ranking, the authors of that study make the assumption that the business and occupation tax, or gross receipts tax, they classify that as a sales tax that is passed on to consumers. So that bumps that up to begin with. And they also assume, we talked about the excise taxes, right? The real excise taxes, the liquor, the cigarette. They assume everybody smokes and drinks in the state of Washington.
Okay.
That gets it added into that. Now, there is an issue about the tax burden for the low income. So is the answer to make people feel better on paper by adding a tax on somebody else, or do you actually target relief? And in fact, just this week, the legislature has finally taken steps, and I know this is something that Andy's group has worked on extensively, to fund the working family tax rate on the books for a decade.
Yeah.
The lawmakers have never prioritized it. That is a great thing to do. You also should take steps about reducing those extremely high excise taxes.
Right.
Don't pass new regressive taxes. We actually have a proposal this year for a statewide soda tax. And cut taxes, cut the sales tax, cut the property taxes.
Yeah.
Actually provide tax relief without blowing up our tax structure, which we know is very stable and predictable.
Thank you very much for that. Andy, I'll jump back to you here because I know the Budget and Policy Center was involved in the crafting of this bill here. And really, if it's supposed to be about changing the tax structure, why is there that big investment in childcare, $350 million? Why is that the top priority? And this investment in a taxpayer fairness account, which gives tax breaks to lower income people, at the bottom? What's the rationale behind that?
Oh, I think your viewers, the parents out there, the caregivers out there totally understand the need for investments in affordable, accessible, high quality childcare right now more than ever. This has been a long-standing need in our state. Small businesses have been calling out for investments in childcare because they know it's good for their workers, they know it's good for their communities, and ultimately good for their bottom lines. So, investing in childcare, using the resources from this very equitable, very reasonable tax on the very richest 0.2% of Washingtonians. To invest in childcare and early learning is absolutely the right move. Which is extremely clear on that. The bang for the buck on childcare, every dollar we put in, we would get 6 or 7 back by investing in childcare. It's an incredibly important investment right now. And as you said, we need to do something to address the exceedingly high effective tax rates for those at the very bottom and the middle. And this tax proposal that we're talking about right now makes good on that too. Puts in funding that comes in above the amount that we would be giving to early learning and childcare, funding important things like the working families tax credit that Jason mentioned before. We're strong opponents of that, and we're really glad that Jason has also been saying good things about the importance of that investment. So it explicitly mentions that as something that would be funded in this bill, and there are other important things that could be done on top of that as well.
Okay.
To start rebalancing on both ends. Exceedingly low, that very special deal for those at the very top, and start reducing it for those in the middle and the bottom.
Got it. Andy, I feel like I need to address this point, though. You've heard what some critics are saying, that taxing capital gains in this way would set some sort of precedent and set up a framework so that eventually we'll all have an income tax placed on all of us in the state. How do you respond to that criticism?
I think lawmakers are listening to communities and completely understand that we need to start rebalancing our tax code. It is essential to our recovery. And this is a very common sense step in that direction, asking those who pay the least, the richest 0.2% of Washingtonians, to pay on the extraordinary profits they reap on, profits above $250,000 per year. Very common sense first step to get down that path of rebalancing, creating a more equitable tax code that serves our state and our communities much better than the one we have now.
Okay. Jason, let me jump back to you because Democrats got input from businesses on Senate Bill 5096 and made a number of concessions. Originally, this was a 9% tax on profits over $25,000. The amended bill, a 7% tax on profits over $250,000. You got a number of major business voices in our state. Sonya Campion, we talked to for our setup piece here. Nick Hanauer, they're saying we want to pay this and pay our fair share here. How do you respond to that piece of it? Because I think there are some people in the business community who are saying, yes, we do want to pay this.
So first of all, if there are individuals who believe they are undertaxed and want to contribute more to Washington, the treasurer actually has an ability to do that. You can contribute whatever you want to the state budget without lawmakers imposing a tax on you. But let me address a few things that came up here in the last segment there. You talked about possible funding for this. Not a cent will be collected, assuming no lawsuit, and we know a lawsuit is going to be filed, until April of 2023. This tax doesn't even take effect until January of next year because we don't have a state IRS. The Department of Revenue has to create the apparatus to collect this income tax.
Yeah.
And again, the money isn't due till April 23. So there's nothing going to be going to child care or tax relief or anything from this bill because the tax just won't be collected. What is the goal for this? Why the litigation? We know from public records this is not about capital gains because no state in the country has a tax on capital gains. Now, I'll repeat that. There is not a standalone tax on capital gains in the country. The 41 states that tax this have income taxes. Capital gains are income.
Yeah.
So it's part of their ordinary income calculation.
Yeah.
We know from the public records the goal of this, because the voters have rejected 6 constitutional amendments to allow a graduated income tax, they want the litigation because they want to see, and it wasn't one ruling in the 1930s. It's been multiple rulings all the way up to the 2000s of the Supreme Court saying income is property. And they're hoping the judges will overturn that since the voters don't do constitutional amendments.
Okay. Andy, I think if you want to respond to that, you certainly may. I wanted to make sure I went down that path of possible legal challenges here and possible challenges from voters, too. The very real possibility that a referendum might face this. And as you know, in the past 10 times here, voters have said no to any sort of thing that even smells like an income tax. Let's try to talk about the legal issues and maybe some of these referendum issues, if indeed this does become law.
Sure. So again, the only people that are really talking about income taxes here are those who are using scare tactics in order to try and distract from the issue at hand here. This is plainly structured as an excise tax. As we said, there are dozens of excise taxes on the books that have been upheld by the courts for decades. The difference here is this is one that would be paid by millionaires and billionaires, and some of them don't want to pay additional taxes, and so they're pulling out all the stops to stop it. But we shouldn't be crafting important public policy decisions around investments in our communities, around a handful of people who don't want to pay their fair share to support the common good. Now, this idea that we should make this voluntary is silly. Ordinary Washingtonians don't get to choose when they pay sales taxes or property taxes or real estate excise taxes. And we shouldn't confer yet another special benefit on the ultra wealthy in our state by giving them the choice of when they want to pay taxes. That's not how it works. And so, you know, this is a excise tax on extraordinary profits. The first $250,000 would be completely exempt, and it would only impact the richest 0.2%, but it would do a ton of good to help us build out of the current mess that we're in right now. We desperately need investments in affordable child care.
Andy, briefly, I want to make sure I ask you pointedly on this one. Are you concerned about the possibility of a referendum for this?
I think that an emergency clause is completely something that should be considered right now. We are in an emergency. 221,000 Washingtonians are still out of work right now. Farm bankruptcies across our state are up 70%. 1 in 3 small businesses in January couldn't make rent. And so we are a long way out of the crisis that we're in right now. And it's great that the federal government is stepping forward to provide us with some funding to help build our way out of that. But that's going to be time limited. And this is going to be coming online right around the time some of those federal dollars start fading away. So this is a sustainable, ongoing stream of resources to invest in childcare and reducing taxes for lower and middle income Washingtonians that will serve us in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah, important to point out that right now 5096 is passed by the Senate, did not have an emergency clause in it. We'll see what the House does with this, and there's a lot still ahead. But Jason, I want to start going down this path with you because supporters of the capital gains tax would say the landscape has really changed since we last voted on taxing wealth in 2010. In fact, there was a King 5 survey not too long ago, showed 59% of people would support this idea of a new tax on the top 2% of our state's investment earners. With that in mind, do you think a referendum would be successful if and when a capital gains tax becomes law?
There is no question in my mind that if a referendum is filed and the voters vote on this in November, they will, for a 11th time, reject an income tax in the state of Washington. That's been consistently their message. And in fact, if supporters of this truly believe the public is clamoring for this, don't make the voters go through the time and expense of qualifying a referendum. Proactively send it to them as a referendum and see, is there support for this? And I just will mention, with respect to the hard work that Andy has put into this, the only people in the world that call a tax on capital gains an excise tax are the supporters. From the IRS to every revenue department to every tax professional in the world will tell you the same thing. It's an income tax.
Okay. Thank you for that piece there. We do need to wrap up here, and I can give you a minute, Andy, here. Capital gains tax bill, as you know, heading to the House, potentially the governor's desk. Tell us what you're hearing maybe on the House side here, some final thoughts for state lawmakers and anyone else following this bill.
Yeah, I think, Rick, that lawmakers are really listening to communities right now. They're seeing the dire need for investment to help grow our way out of there. They know that $500 million in child care recirculated through our communities is absolutely the right way to go. We learned this lesson the hard way the last time around, which is to cut and to rely only on federal dollars when the economy is in trouble. And there are people that never recovered from the last recession. And so lawmakers have learned that lesson. And now I think they're going to go ahead and pass this. They're going to pass it quickly. And as you mentioned, 60% approval from voters in that King 5 Survey USA poll. I think voters are going to support this, and because they know the communities desperately need revenues and they want to rebalance our grossly upside down tax code and make progress on building a recovery that serves all Washingtonians, especially those that have been left behind for the last much more than a decade.
Thank you very much for that. Jason, I'll let you wrap up some last words about this as our state stands really on the brink of establishing potentially a historic but controversial cap gains tax. Give you about a minute, please.
Again, this is not the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, you saw actual reductions in spending by billions of dollars. Without 1 cent of federal funds, and we know $10 billion is on its way to us, our budget will increase substantially. Revenues are growing by at least 7%, with a huge increase expected on the 17th. And in no uncertain terms, in no debate, this is an income tax whose sole purpose is to ask the judges to do what voters have repeatedly refused, and that is to amend the Constitution.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much both for your input here, and we will be right back. What are people on social media saying about this issue? One person writes, "Passage of a capital gains tax in Washington is the major first step in moving from our position as the most regressive tax code in the country to one that is more fair and robust." Another person writes, "It's an illegal attempt to start a state income tax, which is not allowed in our state's constitution." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattle.gov or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, will public school students be returning to classes soon? Remote learning for the past year has been challenging for students and their parents. Now that teachers are getting vaccinated, will districts be able to resume classes before the end of the school year? We'll talk with State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Rakedall, next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.